The morning mist clung to the Yorkshire moors like a shroud as Eleanor Hartley stood at the window of her family's crumbling cottage, watching the sun struggle to break through the grey clouds. At 19 years old, she had known poverty all her life, but never had it felt quite so crushing as it did on this particular morning in the autumn of 1847. Her father sat at the rickety wooden table behind her, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her mother had been dead for 3 years now, claimed by the same fever that had swept through their village and taken so many others. What little they'd had before had dwindled to nearly nothing since then. "It's the only way, Eleanor," her father said, his voice breaking. "The Duke of Ashworth has offered us a way out. A horse, strong and healthy, worth more than we'd see in 5 years of work. With it, I can plough the fields properly, perhaps even hire myself out to other farms. We'd have food through the winter. We'd survive." Eleanor turned from the window, her blue eyes meeting her father's desperate gaze. She was a beautiful girl, with hair the color of spun gold that fell in waves down her back, and a face that might have graced the finest drawing rooms in London under different circumstances. But here, in this forgotten corner of England, beauty was just another burden. "And what does the Duke want in return for this generous gift?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The whole village had been whispering about it for days. Her father couldn't meet her eyes. "You. He wants you as his wife." "I see." Eleanor's voice was steady, though her heart hammered in her chest. "And you've already agreed." "What choice do I have?" Her father's voice rose in anguish. "The rent is 3 months overdue. The landlord says if we don't pay by week's end, we'll be turned out. Winter is coming, Eleanor. We'll die in the streets." Eleanor knew he was right. She'd seen families turned out before, watched them try to make their way to the workhouse in the next town. Most didn't survive the journey, and yet the thought of being sold like livestock, traded for an animal, made her stomach turn. "Tell me about him," she said quietly. "This Duke of Ashworth." Her father shifted uncomfortably. "He's wealthy, owns half the county, lives in that great manor house up on Blackstone Hill. They say he's a solitary man, keeps to himself mostly. No one in the village has seen him in years." "How old is he?" 42, I believe." "More than twice her age." Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to imagine what her life would be like as the wife of a reclusive duke. She'd heard stories about Blackstone Manor, that dark fortress of grey stone that loomed over the valley like a sleeping giant. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, spinning tales of strange lights in the windows at night, and servants who came to town with haunted expressions. "When does he expect me?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. He's sending a carriage." "Tomorrow." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. One more day of freedom, and then she would belong to a stranger, a man who thought so little of human dignity that he would trade a horse for a wife. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howl across the moors. She thought about running away, disappearing into the night and making her way to London or Manchester, finding work in a factory or as a maid in some grand house. But she knew the truth. A young woman alone on the roads was prey for every sort of predator. And even if she made it to a city, what then? She had no references, no connections, no skills beyond the simple household tasks she'd learned from her mother. and her father would die. Without the horse, without the means to work the land or pay the rent, he would be turned out into the coming winter. She couldn't condemn him to that fate, no matter what it cost her. When dawn came, Eleanor dressed in her only good dress, a simple blue cotton that her mother had sewn for her years ago. She brushed her long blonde hair until it shone and pinned it up in a modest style. She wanted to look dignified, to face her fate with her head held high. The carriage arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, a gleaming black vehicle pulled by 4 magnificent horses. The driver was a stern-faced man who said nothing as he helped Eleanor inside, her small bundle of possessions clutched in her hands. Her father stood in the doorway of the cottage, tears streaming down his weathered face. But Eleanor couldn't bear to look at him. If she did, she would break down entirely, and she was determined to maintain her composure. The journey to Blackstone Manor took less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity. The carriage climbed steadily upward, leaving the valley behind, until finally the great house came into view. It was even more imposing than Eleanor had imagined. 3 stories of dark grey stone with towers at each corner and narrow windows that looked like watchful eyes. The grounds were extensive but oddly neglected, with overgrown gardens and untrimmed hedges that gave the whole place an air of melancholy abandonment. The carriage pulled up to the main entrance, and a housekeeper appeared at the door. A thin woman in her 50s with sharp features and an expression that suggested she tasted something bitter. "Miss Hartley, I presume," the woman said without warmth. "I am Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper. His Grace is waiting in the library. Follow me." Eleanor stepped out of the carriage on trembling legs and followed Mrs. Winters through the enormous oak doors and into the house. The interior was as gloomy as the exterior, dark wood paneling, heavy curtains that blocked most of the light, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floors as they walked through corridor after corridor. Finally, Mrs. Winters stopped before a heavy door and knocked once. A deep voice from within called, "Enter." The housekeeper opened the door and gestured for Eleanor to go inside, then disappeared back down the corridor without another word. Eleanor stepped into the library, and for a moment she could only stare. The room was enormous, lined floor to ceiling with books, thousands of them in leather bindings. A fire crackled in the massive fireplace, providing the only real light in the dim space. And standing before that fire, his back to her, was a tall figure in dark clothing. "Close the door," the voice said. Eleanor did as she was told, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. The man turned slowly, and she got her first look at the Duke of Ashworth. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a powerful build. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples, and his face was all sharp angles and hard planes. He might have been handsome once, but there was something in his expression, a coldness, a distance, that made him seem almost inhuman. His eyes were the most striking thing about him, a pale gray that seemed to look right through her. "So," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "you are Eleanor Hartley." "Yes, Your Grace." Eleanor's voice came out stronger than she'd expected. He walked slowly around her, examining her as one might examine a horse at market. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she kept her chin up and her eyes forward. "You're younger than I expected," he said finally. How old are you? 19, Your Grace. 19. He said it as if testing the word. I am 42. Does that trouble you? Would it matter if it did, Your Grace? Something flickered in those cold eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance. You have spirit. I didn't expect that. Forgive me, Your Grace. I was under the impression that you were acquiring a wife, not a piece of furniture. Even furniture might have spirit if it could speak. The Duke's lips twitched, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might actually smile. But the expression passed quickly. You understand the terms of our arrangement? I understand that my father traded me for a horse, yes. And you came anyway. My father would have died without that horse. I may have been sold like chattel, but I'm not so heartless as to let him starve. The Duke studied her for a long moment. You resent me. I resent the circumstances, Your Grace. You're merely taking advantage of them. An honest answer. He walked to a side table and poured himself a glass of brandy. He didn't offer her one. Let me be equally honest with you, Miss Hartley. I have no illusions about this marriage. I don't require love or even affection. What I require is an heir. You will provide me with a son. And in return, you will want for nothing. You'll have fine clothes, good food, servants at your beck and call. You'll never know poverty again. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. And if I fail to provide you with this heir? Let us hope it doesn't come to that. He drained his glass and set it down with a sharp click. We'll be married tomorrow morning. The vicar will come here to perform the ceremony. Mrs. Winters will show you to your rooms and provide you with appropriate clothing. Do you have any questions? Eleanor had 1,000 questions, but she knew that none of them would receive satisfactory answers. No, Your Grace. Then you're dismissed. Eleanor turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. Miss Hartley, one more thing. Don't attempt to leave. The moors can be treacherous, especially for someone unfamiliar with them. And there's nowhere for you to go. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact. But it sent a chill down Eleanor's spine nonetheless. Mrs. Winters was waiting in the corridor to escort Eleanor to her chambers. They climbed a grand staircase to the second floor and walked down another long corridor before the housekeeper opened a door to reveal a suite of rooms that took Eleanor's breath away. There was a sitting room with elegant furniture upholstered in blue silk, a bedroom with an enormous four-poster bed draped in heavy curtains, and a dressing room that was larger than the entire cottage she'd grown up in. The wardrobe stood open, already filled with beautiful dresses in rich fabrics. These were her graces, Mrs. Winters said, her voice softening slightly. The late Duchess. They should fit you well enough. We'll have new ones made once you're married. Eleanor touched one of the dresses, a deep green silk that shimmered in the lamplight. What happened to her? The late Duchess? Mrs. Winters' expression hardened again. That's not something we discuss. Dinner will be brought to you here. His Grace dines alone. A maid will come to help you dress in the morning. The ceremony is at 10 o'clock. With that, she left, and Eleanor found herself alone in rooms that were more luxurious than anything she'd ever imagined. She should have felt grateful, or at least relieved. But all she felt was a deep, aching loneliness. The next morning arrived too quickly. A young maid named Sarah came to help Eleanor dress, choosing a simple white muslin gown from the late Duchess's wardrobe. As Sarah arranged Eleanor's hair, she chattered nervously about the weather and the gardens, carefully avoiding any mention of the Duke or the late Duchess. At precisely 10 o'clock, Eleanor made her way down to the chapel, a small cold room on the ground floor with high windows and stone walls. The Duke was already there, standing before the altar with the vicar, a nervous-looking man who kept mopping his brow with a handkerchief. Mrs. Winters and two other servants were the only witnesses. The ceremony was brief and perfunctory. Eleanor spoke her vows in a clear voice, though her hands trembled as the Duke slipped a heavy gold ring onto her finger. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the Duke didn't kiss her. He simply nodded once, thanked the vicar, and walked out of the chapel. Eleanor stood there, still in her white dress, now the Duchess of Ashworth, and wondered what she had done. The days that followed established a pattern that Eleanor quickly realized would define her new life. She saw the Duke only at dinner, which they took together in the vast dining room. He sat at one end of the long table, she at the other, with 20 feet of polished mahogany between them. They ate in near silence, the Duke occasionally asking her if she had everything she needed, Eleanor replying that she did. After dinner, he would retire to his library, and she wouldn't see him again until the following evening. Her days were empty. Mrs. Winters ran the household with ruthless efficiency, leaving Eleanor with no duties to occupy her time. She explored the house, wandering through room after room, finding them all beautifully furnished but oddly lifeless, as if no one had actually lived in them for years. She discovered a music room with a pianoforte, but when she tried to play it, the sound seemed to die in the heavy air. The library called to her. She'd always loved reading, though books had been a rare luxury in her old life. Here, there were thousands of them, on every subject imaginable. She began spending her days there, curled up in a chair by the window with volume after volume, losing herself in other worlds and other lives. It was there that the Duke found her one afternoon, 2 weeks after their wedding. She'd been so absorbed in a novel that she hadn't heard him enter. "You read," he said, and there was something like surprise in his voice. Eleanor looked up startled. "Yes, Your Grace. I hope you don't mind." "Why would I mind? They're just gathering dust otherwise." He moved closer, glancing at the title of her book. Sense and Sensibility. "You like Miss Austen?" "Very much. My mother taught me to read. She said it was the greatest gift she could give me." "Your mother was a wise woman." He stood there for a moment, seeming uncertain, which was strange for a man who always seemed so completely in control. "I've been meaning to speak with you about something." Eleanor closed her book, her heart beginning to race. She knew what was coming. They'd been married for 2 weeks, and he hadn't yet come to her bed. She'd been grateful for the reprieve, but she knew it couldn't last forever. "It's time," he said simply. "Tonight. I'll come to your chambers after dinner." Eleanor felt her face go hot. "I understand, Your Grace." He turned to leave, then paused. "You don't need to be afraid. I'm not a monster, whatever you may think of me." But he left before she could respond. That night, Eleanor sat in her bedroom, wearing a nightgown that Sarah had laid out for her, another garment that had belonged to the late Duchess. She'd braided her long blonde hair and was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, when she heard the knock on the door. "Come in," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. The Duke entered, wearing a dark silk dressing gown. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. "You're trembling," he said. "I've never—" Eleanor couldn't finish the sentence. "I know." He crossed the room and sat down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Eleanor, look at me." She did, meeting those pale gray eyes. "I know the circumstances of our marriage are not what any young woman would choose," he said quietly. "But I'm not going to hurt you. This doesn't have to be unpleasant." "How can it be anything but unpleasant?" Eleanor's voice broke. "You don't know me. You don't care for me. I'm just a means to an end." To her surprise, the Duke looked away. "You're right. This is a business arrangement. But that doesn't mean we have to be cruel to each other." He stood up. "I'm going to give you more time. You're not ready, and I won't force you." "But you need an heir," Eleanor said, confused by this unexpected mercy. "I've waited 42 years. I can wait a bit longer." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Good night, Eleanor." "Wait," she said, and he turned back. "Why did you do this? Why did you arrange this marriage? Surely a duke could have his pick of eligible young ladies from good families. Why bargain for a poor girl from the village?" The Duke was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "Because no woman of quality would have me. Not anymore. Not after—" He stopped himself. "Good night, Eleanor." This time, he left before she could ask anything more. After that night, something shifted between them. The Duke began spending more time in the library when Eleanor was there, sitting in the chair across from hers, reading his own books. At first, they didn't speak, but gradually they began to exchange comments about what they were reading, then opinions, then actual conversations. Eleanor learned that the Duke, whose given name was Alexander, though she still couldn't bring herself to call him by it, was remarkably well educated. He'd studied at Cambridge and traveled extensively in his youth. He had opinions on everything from politics to poetry, and he listened to her opinions with a respect that surprised her. She also learned that he wasn't quite as cold as he first appeared. There was a dry wit hidden beneath that severe exterior, and occasionally he would say something that made her laugh, though he never smiled himself. One rainy afternoon, about a month after their wedding, Eleanor worked up the courage to ask about his first wife. They were in the library, as had become their custom. Alexander was reading a book on agricultural improvements, and Eleanor had been watching him for several minutes, trying to find the right words. "Your Grace," she said finally, "may I ask you something personal?" He looked up. "You may ask. I may not answer. What happened to your first wife?" His expression darkened immediately, and Eleanor regretted the question. But to her surprise, he answered, "Catherine died 7 years ago. She fell from a horse and broke her neck. It was my fault." "How could it be your fault?" "I bought her the horse, a spirited mare, too much for her to handle. But she wanted it, and I—" He closed his book with a snap. "I gave her everything she wanted, and it killed her." "That doesn't make it your fault. It was an accident." "Was it?" He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. "Sometimes I think she did it on purpose, to escape me." "Why would she want to escape you?" Alexander turned to face her. and the pain in his eyes made Eleanor's heart ache. Because I'm not easy to live with, Eleanor. I'm cold. I'm distant. Catherine used to cry and beg me to show her some affection, some warmth. But I couldn't. I didn't know how. And eventually, she stopped trying. She became as cold as me. Or perhaps she was just tired of breaking her heart against a stone wall. Eleanor stood and crossed the room to him. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm. You're not a stone wall. I've seen glimpses of the man underneath. He's worth knowing. Alexander looked down at her hand, on his arm, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she'd made a terrible mistake. But then he covered her hand with his own. You're very kind, he said softly. Far kinder than I deserve. From that day forward, their relationship began to change in earnest. Alexander began joining her for breakfast as well as dinner. He took her on walks around the grounds, pointing out features of the estate and telling her stories about his childhood. Eleanor learned that he'd been a lonely boy, the only child of parents who had little time for him, raised mostly by servants in this vast, empty house. I learned early not to expect affection, he told her one afternoon as they stood looking out over the moors. It was easier than being disappointed. That's a sad way to live, Eleanor said. Perhaps, but it's the only way I know. Eleanor found herself thinking about Alexander more and more. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he was amused, even though he never quite smiled. She noticed the way he absently ran his hand through his hair when he was deep in thought. She noticed the gentleness in his hands when he helped her over a rough patch of ground during their walks. She was beginning to care for him, and the realization terrified her. One evening in early December, nearly 3 months after their wedding, Alexander came to her chambers again. Eleanor had been sitting by the fire, reading, when she heard his knock. Come in, she said, setting down her book. He entered, and this time there was no distance in his expression, only a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. Eleanor, he said, I've been patient, but I find that my reasons for patience have changed. What do you mean? He crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. At first, I waited because I didn't want to force you. But now, I find myself wanting to wait until you want me. Not as a duty, not because you're my wife, but because you actually want me. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. And if I do? Want you, I mean. Do you? His grey eyes searched hers. Eleanor thought about lying, about protecting herself, but she found she couldn't. Yes, she whispered. I do. Alexander's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. I don't know how to do this properly, he said. I don't know how to be gentle or romantic or any of the things a young woman like you deserves. But I want to try. Will you let me try? In answer, Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him. It was her first kiss, tentative and uncertain. But Alexander responded with a hunger that took her breath away. He pulled her up from the chair and into his arms, and Eleanor felt something inside her ignite. That night, Eleanor gave herself to her husband not out of duty, but out of genuine desire. Alexander was true to his word. He was gentle with her, patient, taking his time despite his obvious need. And when it was over, he didn't leave. He stayed holding her in his arms, stroking her hair as she drifted off to sleep. When Eleanor woke the next morning, she found Alexander still there, propped up on one elbow, watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. There was something soft in his eyes, something almost tender. "Good morning," she said shyly. "Good morning." He bent to kiss her forehead. "Are you well? I didn't hurt you." "No, you are very gentle." He smiled then, a real smile, and Eleanor realized it was the first time she'd ever seen him do so. It transformed his entire face, making him look years younger. "What?" he asked, seeing her expression. "You smiled. I've never seen you smile before." "Haven't you?" "Perhaps I've had no reason to." He tucked a strand of her blonde hair behind her ear. "Until now." From that night on, Alexander came to Eleanor's bed regularly, and each time, the connection between them grew stronger. But more than that, they were becoming true companions. They spent their days together now, reading in the library, walking the grounds, even riding out to visit her father, who was doing much better now with the help of the horse Alexander had given him. Eleanor's father wept when he saw how happy his daughter looked, how the Duke treated her with respect and obvious affection. "I was so afraid," he told her. "I thought I'd condemned you to a life of misery." "You saved both our lives," Eleanor assured him, "and perhaps you saved his as well." Winter settled over the Yorkshire moors, and Blackstone Manor, which had seemed so gloomy when Eleanor first arrived, began to feel almost like a home. She convinced Alexander to let her redecorate some of the rooms, bringing in lighter curtains and brighter colors. She had the gardeners begin planning improvements to the grounds for spring. And slowly, the house began to wake up. Alexander watched these changes with bemusement, but he didn't interfere. If anything, he seemed pleased to see life returning to his ancestral home. It was in late January, on a snowy afternoon, that Eleanor made a discovery that would change everything. She'd been feeling unwell for several days, tired and queasy, especially in the mornings. She'd been trying to hide it from Alexander, not wanting to worry him, but Sarah the maid had noticed. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace," Sarah said one morning as she helped Eleanor dress, "but I think you might want to send for the doctor." "It's just a bit of stomach upset," Eleanor said. "It will pass." Sarah gave her a knowing look. "I think it might be more than that, Your Grace. My mom had 6 of us, and she always said the morning sickness was the worst part." Eleanor froze. "Morning sickness?" "Yes, Your Grace. I think you might be with child." The doctor came that very day and confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Eleanor was indeed pregnant, probably about 2 months along. The baby would come in the late summer. Eleanor sat in her chamber after the doctor left, her hand on her still flat stomach, trying to process this news. She was going to be a mother. She was going to give Alexander the heir he'd married her for. But the thought filled her with a strange mixture of joy and fear. She was happy about the baby. She'd always wanted children, but she couldn't help remembering Alexander's words. "What I require is an heir. You will provide me with a son." Now that she'd fulfilled that purpose, would things change between them? Would he go back to being the cold, distant man she'd first met? When Alexander came to her chambers that evening, Eleanor was still sitting in the same chair, lost in thought. "The doctor was here," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Winters told me. Is it true? Are you with child?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. To her surprise, Alexander crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. Thank God. He breathed into her hair. Thank God? You're pleased? Eleanor asked. He pulled back to look at her, and there was something fierce in his expression. Pleased? Eleanor, He seemed to struggle for words. I'm beyond pleased, but not because of the heir. Yes, that's important, but... He cupped her face in his hands. I'm happy because it's our child, yours and mine. A piece of you and a piece of me, bound together. Do you understand? Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. I was so afraid you'd go back to being distant once I'd given you what you wanted. What I wanted? Alexander gave a short laugh. Eleanor, what I wanted when I arranged this marriage and what I want now are two entirely different things. I wanted an heir, yes, but now I want... He stopped, looking almost afraid. What? Eleanor prompted gently. What do you want now? You, he said simply. Just you. Your company, your laughter, your kindness. The way you've brought light into this dark house. The way you see through my defenses to the man underneath. I want all of it. I want you, Eleanor. Not as a means to an heir, but for yourself. Alexander? It was the first time Eleanor had called him by his given name, and she saw his eyes widen at the sound of it. I want you too. I know. I've fallen in love with you. For a long moment, Alexander just stared at her. Then, in a voice rough with emotion, he said, I don't deserve your love, but God help me. I want it anyway. And Eleanor, I love you too. I don't know when it happened. Perhaps it was gradual, or perhaps it was all at once. But I love you more than I thought myself capable of loving anyone. They kissed then, and it was different from all their previous kisses. Deeper, more meaningful, filled with the promise of a real future together. The months that followed were the happiest Eleanor had ever known. Her pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Alexander was attentive to the point of being overprotective. He refused to let her do anything that might be remotely strenuous, and he was constantly asking if she needed anything. I'm having a baby, not dying of consumption, Eleanor told him one day with exasperation, though she couldn't help being touched by his concern. I know, he said, but I can't help worrying. After Catherine... I'm not Catherine, Eleanor said gently, and I'm being careful. I promise. As spring arrived and Eleanor's belly began to swell with their child, the changes in Blackstone Manor became even more pronounced. The gardens that Eleanor had planned began to take shape, with beds of flowers and trimmed hedges replacing the overgrown wilderness. Inside, the house was filled with light and life. Alexander hired more servants, younger ones who brought energy and noise to the once silent corridors. And most remarkable of all, Alexander himself was changing. He smiled now, frequently. He laughed at Eleanor's jokes. He was patient with the servants in a way he'd never been before. It was as if Eleanor's love had thawed something frozen inside him, allowing the man he might have been to finally emerge. In late August, on a warm afternoon when the moors were purple with heather, Eleanor's labor began. Alexander paced in the corridor outside her chambers for hours, driving Mrs. Winters to distraction with his constant questions. Finally, just as the sun was setting, he heard the sound he'd been waiting for, the cry of a newborn baby. The midwife emerged with a smile. Your Grace, you have a son, and Her Grace is well. Alexander burst into the room without waiting for permission. Eleanor lay in the bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a small bundle wrapped in white linen. She looked up as he entered, and the smile she gave him took his breath away. "Come meet your son," she said. Alexander crossed to the bed and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small mewling sounds. As Alexander watched, the infant opened his eyes, pale gray, just like his father's. "He's perfect," Alexander breathed. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and put his arm around Eleanor, the three of them forming a circle. "You're perfect, both of you." "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked. Alexander thought for a moment. "William, after my grandfather. He was the only member of my family who ever showed me real kindness." "William Ashworth," Eleanor said, testing the name. "I like it." They sat there for a long time, watching their son sleep, and Eleanor marveled at how completely her life had changed. Less than a year ago, she'd been a poor girl living in a crumbling cottage, traded for a horse to a man she thought was cold and heartless. Now she was a duchess, mother to an heir, and wife to a man she loved deeply, a man who loved her in return. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked, seeing her expression. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am," Eleanor said, "for all of it, even the difficult parts, because they led me here, to this moment." Alexander kissed her forehead. "I'm the one who should be grateful. You saved me, Eleanor. Before you came, I was just existing, not really living. You taught me what it means to love and be loved. You gave me a reason to be better." "We saved each other," Eleanor said, looking down at their sleeping son. "And now we have this new life to love and protect." As the months and years passed, Blackstone Manor truly became a home. William grew into a lively, happy child, and he was soon joined by a sister, Catherine, named for Alexander's first wife at Eleanor's suggestion. Alexander had wept when Eleanor told him what she wanted to call their daughter, understanding it for what it was: forgiveness and acceptance of his past. Eleanor's father lived to see his grandchildren, spending his final years in a comfortable cottage on the estate, where he was visited often by his daughter and her family. He died peacefully in his sleep one winter night, and Eleanor mourned him deeply, but took comfort in knowing that he'd lived long enough to see her happy. As for Alexander and Eleanor, their love only deepened with time. They had their disagreements, of course. No marriage is perfect. But they'd learned how to talk to each other, how to be honest about their fears and needs. Alexander was never quite as demonstrative as some husbands, but Eleanor didn't need grand gestures. She saw his love in the little things, the way he always made sure her favorite books were available in the library, the way he would take her hand during their evening walks, the way he looked at her across the dinner table as if she were the most precious thing in the world. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Alexander took Eleanor back to the library where they'd first begun to truly know each other. He'd had the servants prepare it specially, with candles and flowers and a bottle of fine wine. 10 years, he said as they sat together by the fire. 10 years since your father traded you for a horse. Eleanor laughed. Don't remind me. It's still the most insulting and wonderful thing that's ever happened to me. I was thinking about that transaction, Alexander said, and I've decided it was terribly one-sided. Oh? Yes, your father got one horse. A good horse, admittedly, but still just one horse. And I got everything. A wife, a family, a life worth living. It was the best bargain I ever made, even if I didn't know it at the time. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. I think we both got the better end of that deal, in the end. Perhaps, Alexander said, but I still think I owe your father an apology for taking advantage of him so shamelessly. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the fire, and Eleanor thought about the strange path her life had taken. She'd started with nothing, been sold for an animal, married a man she thought she'd never love. But somehow, through a combination of patience, compassion, and fate, she'd found herself in a true love match, the kind of marriage most women only dreamed of. "What are you thinking now?" Alexander asked, as he so often did. "I'm thinking that I wouldn't change a single thing," Eleanor said. "Not the poverty, not the fear, not even that terrible first day when I arrived here thinking my life was over. Because all of it was necessary to bring us to where we are now." Alexander lifted her hand and kissed it gently. "I would change things. If I could go back, I'd be kinder to you from the start. I'd tell you that you were beautiful and brave. I'd make you feel welcome instead of making you feel like a transaction." "But then we wouldn't be who we are now," Eleanor said. "You needed time to learn how to open your heart. And I needed time to see past your defenses to the good man underneath. If it had been easy, maybe we wouldn't appreciate it as much." "You're far wiser than I am," Alexander said with a small smile. "I learned from the best," Eleanor replied, squeezing his hand. They stayed up late that night, talking about everything and nothing, the way they often did. Alexander told her stories about his travels in his youth, the places he'd seen and the adventures he'd had before life and loss had hardened him. Eleanor spoke about her dreams for their children, her hopes that William would grow up to be as honorable as his father, that Catherine would be as strong as her mother. "Do you ever miss it?" Alexander asked suddenly. "Your old life, it was simpler in some ways." Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I miss my mother sometimes, and there was a freedom in having nothing, no expectations, no responsibilities. But no, I don't miss the poverty or the fear or the uncertainty. And I certainly don't miss not knowing you. Even when I was at my worst?" "Especially then," Eleanor said. "Because seeing you at your worst made me appreciate you at your best all the more." As they finally made their way upstairs to their bedchamber, they'd been sharing the same bed for years now. Eleanor paused at the window on the landing, looking out over the moonlit moors. Alexander came to stand beside her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Eleanor asked. "When you came to my chambers." "I said a lot of things, most of them foolish. You said you'd give me time because I wasn't ready. That was the moment I first thought there might be hope for us. That underneath all that coldness, there was a decent man." "I was terrified that night," Alexander admitted. "You were so young, so beautiful, and you looked at me with such fear in your eyes. I couldn't bear to add to that fear. And I think, even then, part of me already cared for you. I just didn't recognize it yet." "When did you know?" Eleanor asked. "When did you realize you loved me?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his chin resting on top of her head. "Do you remember that day in the library when you asked me about Catherine? And I told you everything, all my failures and regrets. You could have judged me. You could have pulled away. But instead, you touched my arm and told me I was worth knowing. That was the moment. That was when I knew I loved you." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "And I knew I loved you the day you smiled for the first time. It was like watching the sun come out from behind clouds. I realized then that you weren't cold at all. You'd just been alone for so long that you'd forgotten how to be warm." They kissed then, a soft, lingering kiss that spoke of years of companionship and love. When they finally drew apart, Alexander said, "Come to bed, my love. Tomorrow is another day, and I want to wake up with you beside me." The years continued to pass peacefully at Blackstone Manor. William grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as his parents did. Catherine was more adventurous, always getting into mischief and charming her way out of trouble. Two more children followed, twin boys named Thomas and Edward, who seemed determined to turn the once quiet manor into a circus. Eleanor watched Alexander with their children and marveled at the transformation in him. He was patient with their questions, gentle with their fears, and generous with his affection. He was the father he'd wished for as a boy, breaking the cycle of coldness that had plagued his family for generations. One autumn day, when William was 12 and preparing to go away to school, Eleanor found Alexander in the library, looking melancholy. "What troubles you?" she asked, settling into her usual chair across from him. "I'm thinking about time," he said. "How quickly it passes. It seems like only yesterday that you arrived here, a frightened girl who'd been traded for a horse. And now, look at us, middle-aged, with children nearly grown." "You're not middle-aged," Eleanor protested. "You're distinguished." That earned her a smile. Diplomatic as always. "But Eleanor, I've been thinking. I want to do something for the village, for families like yours once was. I have more money than we could ever spend, and it seems wrong to hoard it when there are people struggling the way your father struggled." "What did you have in mind?" "A school, perhaps. Free education for all the children, not just those whose families can afford it. And maybe some kind of fund to help families in crisis. So, no father ever has to choose between his daughter's future and his own survival." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Alexander, that's a wonderful idea. Your heart has grown so large. I sometimes forget you ever had walls around it. I owe it all to you," he said simply. "You taught me how to care again. The least I can do is share that with others." They spent the next several months working together on the project, Eleanor helping to plan the school, while Alexander handled the finances and legal matters. The village was skeptical at first. The Duke of Ashworth had been a distant, almost mythical figure for so long that they didn't quite trust this sudden generosity. But Eleanor, who made a point of visiting the village regularly and getting to know the families there, gradually won them over. The school opened the following spring, a beautiful stone building with large windows and a well-stocked library. Alexander insisted that Elena be the one to cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony. As she stood there, surrounded by grateful villagers and excited children, she thought about how far she'd come from the girl who'd stood in a crumbling cottage and agreed to be traded for a horse. "You've done a good thing here," she told Alexander that night. "We've done a good thing," he corrected. "I only had the idea. You made it real." As they lay in bed that night, Eleanor's head on Alexander's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she felt a profound sense of contentment. Her life hadn't turned out anything like she'd expected, but it had turned out so much better than she'd ever dared to hope. "Alexander," she said softly, "hmm? Do you believe in fate?" "I don't know," he said. "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes I think we were always meant to find each other. That everything that happened, all the hardship, all the desperation, was leading us to that moment when my father made his bargain with you. If that's true, then I'm grateful for every twist of fate that brought you to me," Alexander said, "even the painful ones." "Even the horse?" Eleanor asked with a smile. "Especially the horse," Alexander said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "That horse was the best investment I ever made." Years continued to unfold, bringing with them the joys and sorrows that come with any life. They lost Alexander's elderly aunt, who'd never approved of his marriage to a commoner, but who'd softened toward Eleanor in her final years. They celebrated as William distinguished himself at Cambridge, and Thomas showed a remarkable talent for music. They weathered Catherine's rebellious phase and Edward's illness, which thankfully passed without serious consequences. Through it all, Alexander and Eleanor remained each other's anchors. They still took their evening walks together, still spent their afternoons reading in the library, still talked late into the night about everything and nothing. Their physical passion had mellowed into a deep, comfortable intimacy, but they were no less devoted to each other than they'd been in those early days of discovery. On Eleanor's 40th birthday, Alexander gave her a portrait he'd commissioned, a painting of her sitting in the library, a book in her lap, sunlight streaming through the window and turning her still golden hair to spun light. She looked happy in the portrait, content, and it captured something essential about who she'd become. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed. "But Alexander, you shouldn't have spent so much." "Nonsense," he said. "I wanted to capture you exactly as you are, the woman who saved me from myself. Besides, I'm planning to have it hung in the gallery with all the other Duchesses of Ashworth. You deserve to be remembered." "I'd rather be remembered for what we did together," Eleanor said. "The school, the improvements to the estate, the way we raised our children. That's a better legacy than any portrait." "Then we'll be remembered for that too," Alexander said. "But humor me. Let me have this portrait of you. When I'm old and gray, and you're tired of me, I'll look at it and remember why I fell in love with you." "I'll never tire of you," Eleanor said, reaching up to touch his face. There was more gray in his hair now, and lines around his eyes, but to her he was as handsome as ever. "And you're already gray." "Impertinent woman," he said with mock severity, but his eyes were warm. Time moved on, as it always does. Their children grew up and married, bringing grandchildren who filled Blackstone Manor with noise and laughter. William became a respected scholar. Catherine married a country doctor and devoted herself to helping the poor. Thomas became a renowned pianist, and Edward took over the management of the estate, showing a natural talent for agriculture that made his father proud. Alexander and Eleanor grew old together, their hair turning white, their steps becoming slower, but their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by years of shared experiences and mutual support. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at Blackstone Manor for a celebration. There were dozens of people, children, grandchildren, even a few great-grandchildren. The house was filled with music and laughter, so different from the silent, gloomy place it had once been. That evening, after the party had died down and most of the family had gone to bed, Alexander and Eleanor slipped away to the library, their sanctuary. They sat in their usual chairs, now worn and comfortable, and looked at each other across the space that had once separated them, but no longer did. 50 years, Alexander said. Half a century. Can you believe it? Some days it feels like forever, Eleanor said with a smile. Other days it feels like no time at all. Do you have any regrets? Eleanor thought about the question seriously. I regret that my mother didn't live to see me happy. I regret that my father spent so many years racked with guilt over what he did. Even though I told him time and again that I forgave him. But as for us, as for our life together, no regrets, not one. Not even being traded for a horse? Alexander asked with a wry smile. Not even that, Eleanor said firmly. Because that horse brought me to you. And you, Alexander Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth, have been the great adventure of my life. You've been my partner, my love, my best friend. How could I regret any of it? Alexander stood up slowly. His joints weren't what they used to be, and crossed to her chair. He knelt down beside it, just as he had all those years ago when he'd asked if she wanted him. Eleanor, he said, taking her wrinkled hands in his. I spent the first 42 years of my life thinking I was incapable of love, that my heart was too cold, too damaged. And then you came along and proved me wrong. You've given me 50 years of happiness that I never thought I'd have. You've given me children and grandchildren, laughter and light. You've turned this house from a tomb into a home. And most of all, you've given me yourself, your patience, your kindness, your unwavering love. I don't have adequate words to thank you for all of it. You don't need to thank me, Eleanor said, touching his face tenderly. Loving you has been my greatest joy, even when it was difficult, even when you were stubborn or distant or infuriating. And yes, you were all those things sometimes. I never doubted that beneath it all was a good man, worthy of love. I'm not sure I was worthy, Alexander said, but you made me want to be. You made me want to be better. They stayed there for a long time, holding hands, comfortable in the silence that comes from decades of companionship. Finally, Eleanor said, Come to bed, my love. We're too old to be staying up this late. As they slowly climbed the stairs together, Eleanor supporting Alexander when his bad knee acted up, and Alexander steadying Eleanor when she got dizzy, Eleanor thought about all the stairs they'd climbed together over the years. All the conversations, all the challenges, all the joys and sorrows they'd shared. When they finally settled into bed, Eleanor curled into Alexander's side, her head on his shoulder, just as she'd done for 50 years. His arm came around her automatically, holding her close. Eleanor, Alexander said softly. Yes? I love you. I've loved you almost from the beginning, and I'll love you until my last breath. And I love you, Eleanor whispered back, more than words can say. They drifted off to sleep together, two souls who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a life and a love that had endured through half a century of changes and challenges. And in the morning, they'd wake up and do it all over again, because that's what love is. Not just a feeling, but a choice made new each day. The story of Eleanor Hartley, the poor girl who was traded for a horse, and became the Duchess of Ashworth, became something of a legend in the county. People told it to their children and grandchildren, sometimes as a cautionary tale about the cruelties of poverty, sometimes as a romantic story about unlikely love, always as a testament to the power of kindness and patience to transform even the coldest heart. But for Eleanor herself, it was simply her life, a life that had started in desperation and fear, but had bloomed into something beautiful. She'd been sold like chattel, treated as a means to an end, and yet she'd found real love and real happiness. She turned a business arrangement into a true marriage, a cold house into a warm home, a lonely duke into a loving husband and father. And that, she often thought, was the real magic of it all. Not that she'd been traded for a horse, but that she'd taken that degrading beginning and built something wonderful from it. She'd proven that love could grow even in the rockiest soil, that hope could flourish even in the darkest circumstances, and that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the happiest endings. As Eleanor and Alexander grew older still, into their 70s and 80s, they remained devoted to each other. They watched their grandchildren grow up and have children of their own. They saw the village school they'd founded expand and flourish. They witnessed England changing around them, the old ways slowly giving way to new ideas and new possibilities. And through it all, they had each other. When Alexander's health began to fail, Eleanor was there by his side, reading to him in the library they'd shared for so many years. When Eleanor had a bad fall and broke her hip, Alexander barely left her side during her recovery. They'd grown old together, and they intended to face whatever came next together as well, because that was what they'd always done. Face life as partners, as equals, as two halves of a whole that was stronger than either of them alone. The story doesn't end with some grand gesture or dramatic moment. Instead, it ends the way most true love stories do, with two elderly people sitting together in the evening light, holding hands, comfortable in their silence, grateful for the life they've shared. They'd started as a business transaction, become lovers, grown into partners, and ended as soulmates. And really, what more could anyone ask from a life? Eleanor Hartley, who'd been sold for a horse at 19, had found something infinitely more valuable. A love that lasted a lifetime, a partnership that weathered every storm, and a family that would carry their legacy forward for generations. She'd been traded like property, but she'd ended up priceless. And that, she often reflected with a quiet smile, was the greatest irony and the greatest triumph of her life.